Detroit was synonymous with that sweet soul sound pioneered by Berry Gordy's label. But in 1969, something dark and primal emerged. The opposite of that pitch-perfect choreographed sheen that was Motown. That something was the Stooges. The Stooges' eponymous debut album was a corrosive swell of snarling guitars and feral howls from Iggy, of course, whose cock-waggling and self-mutilation is presented as an unhinged carnival of rock and roll rebellion. Iggy Stooge, as he was then known, was the frontman of the psychedelic Stooges, a band that took their name from the Three Stooges. A band described by Robert Christgau as a stupid rock at its best. Interestingly, in 1957, the Reverend Jimmy Snow suggested a causal relationship between juvenile delinquency and rock and roll. I think the Stooges' onstage antics perfectly supports this hypothesis. And Iggy would dance around the stage's wiry, balletic, carnal displays of shamanic power that electrified the audience, as half of them enraptured, half of them enraged. And this from as I said before, a band that takes their name from the Three Stooges. Iggy, of course, taking his name from the coolest animal ever, as far as he was concerned. Now, of course, he used to play drums for a band called the Iguanas, and it was there that he took the name Iggy. This was a group that was described as a greasy little rock and roll band. Sounds like something Frank Zappa would say. Rolling Stone led a cavalcade of abuse regarding this band, calling them loud, boring, tasteless, unimaginative and childish, although they were championed by Lester Bangs. Lester Bangs, as I've said before many times, who saw them as something primal, embracing the spirit of rock and roll, which as far as he's concerned should draw from that African-American idiom. He recognised that in the Stooges. But Bang, writing for Cream magazine in the very early 70s, started to use the term punk rock, applied to bands like the MC5s and the Stooges, those garage bands, of course. That was a few years before the whole thing would explode in Camden or London generally, from about 1976 onwards. And that punk explosion in the UK, there's no doubt that the Stooges were in part the keg that had been placed underneath it all, underneath the music establishment. So influential, and so many people have cited the Stooges as a huge influence. I mean, for example, Brian James, guitarist in a band then called Bastard, who went on to form two crucial groups called the London SS, from whose ashes would spring the Clash and Generation X, and the Damned, of course. Ian Curtis, an aspiring singer in Manchester, was hugely influenced by Iggy Pop. In fact, the Idiot was left playing on his turntable when he tragically hanged himself in around about 1980, I think that was. And other English kids like John Lydon and Glenn Matlock, which would incorporate Stooges numbers in the setlist of their burgeoning band at the time, the Sex Pistols. And even decades later, artists like Anthony Kiedis and Jack White would cite the Stooges as a huge influence. And even Kurt Cobain in his journal will state that Raw Power was his favourite album of all time. If you rewind the clock back to 1969, it was Elektra that signed the Stooges. I mean, Danny Fields came out to sign the MC5s, believe it or not, but was so impressed that the Stooges live performance decided to sign them as well. So they headed to New York to record their debut album with the Velvet Underground's John Cale. They didn't have enough material. It was actually Jack Holzman, the label boss, that sent them to a hotel room with a 2-day ultimatum to fill out this album. What they emerged with was a full-on collection of odd curios. This dirge-like garage rock, which I think was hugely inspired by John Cale. Cale reined in some of the material. For example, 1969, he shepherded it away from being a sort of kind of a free-form wig out. It was at this time, of course, they recorded I Want to Be Your Dog. Cale also plays viola on We Will Fall, which is a 10-minute slab of druggy stupor. And its composition centres around the droning viola of John Cale. It could have been lifted straight from a Velvet Underground album. In fact, many critics have argued that it's reminiscent of the Velvet Underground's The Gift. Mock Gregorian chant vocals providing the counter melody to Iggy's very Lou Reed styled vocals. This album and band became iconic as Iggy metamorphosized from Iggy Stooge to Iggy Pop. The name Pop was conferred upon him after he shaved his eyebrows off and looked like a hometown character named Jim Pop, whose all his hair had fallen out, so that's where his name comes from. And the band at this juncture, of course, were Iggy Pop, guitarist Ron Ashton, bassist Dave Alexander, Ron's brother Scott on drums. What marked this album as different, even in 1969, is its rawness. There was no affected studio arrangements at all. And believe it or not, these were still very much in vogue in 1969, even as America navigated its path away from psychedelia. This, of course, gives this album a one-take live in the studio feel, which is refreshingly honest. If we think about the tracks on this album, I Want to Be Your Dog is perhaps the most well-known. Many have suggested that it's similar to the standard blues riff of Yusuf Lateef's Eastern Market, a number from his Detroit album. Iggy Pop has said that this is just really a song about wanting to sleep with your head in a girl's lap. But the S&M overtones here are quite blatant, reminiscent of the Velvet Underground's Venus in Furs. No Fun is based on a simple chord change lifted, I think, from Question Mark and the Mysterians' Garage Staple, which was 96 Tears. A song that was done beautifully, I think, by the Stranglers around about 1989. The dirge-like Dance of Romance has a very distinctive stoner riff to it. I think it still feels very much in vogue, still feels very fresh when you listen to it today. Interesting, the track We Will Fall, many have suggested that it's actually based upon a chant by Indian guru Swami Ramadas, as well as numbers like I Want to Be Your Dog and 1969 No Fun. There was also this chaotic freeform jam, which the record company, I think, have sat on for a number of years. Many have said that it was actually a Stooges number called Asthma Attack, which would often feature in their live set. Little Doll lifts its bass line from Upper and Lower Egypt by Pharoah Sanders, the ex-Coltrane saxophonist. Real Cool Time, of course, is the briefest song on the album, and the track Anne feels like a kind of Doors homage to me. And speaking of the Doors, we must address the photo session for this album. The Joel Brodsky was brought in to take the photograph of the band. Joel Brodsky, as you know, photographed the famous Jim Morrison Lion picture, as well as the first two covers of their first two albums, The Doors and Strange Days. Well, Joel Brodsky had heard that Iggy was quite a physical performer. He turned up at the photo shoot and asked Iggy if he wouldn't mind jumping in the air. Iggy, of course, obliged him. Didn't give any thought about how he was going to land, subsequently landed on his face. The rest of the Stooges and Joel Brodsky rushed him off to hospital, where he had stitches in his chin. So the stitches were airbrushed out for the photo shoot for the album cover. In the end, they just decided to replicate the cover of the first Doors album. Nevertheless, the front cover seems to suggest middle-class kids gone wrong in their leather jackets and pouts and snot-nosed defiance. This band and this album were a seismic moment in rock that swam against the Lovin' vibe, as did the Alice Cooper band. They were certainly on the same page, but there was less vaudevillian shock rock quality that you got with the Alice Cooper band, and more a kind of an unhinged glimpse into what was to come in the 1970s. This is an important album which I think you should definitely have in your collection. So there you are, that's my case for this album. If you watched to this point without switching off, I thank you wholeheartedly for doing that and urge you to go a step further. And please, if you haven't already done so, please do click like, subscribe and check the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. So I will leave you with my closing salvo, which, as you know, is hope you're well, staying safe, but more importantly that you keep listening.